You're very welcome to this Under the London Sky conversation. It's 1 a.m. in the morning here, and I think you're probably seeing it the day after. And I can tell you what we're going to talk about. These are things that have come out of our super brief conversation about progress, Russian Tsars, Tsar Alexander III, and Vladimir Putin on the main channel. And what people have been asking, and this is not a Q&A session, these are just a couple of things that have come through mainly by email since that episode. Vlad, what on earth are you doing in that video telling us that you are kind of personally drawn to Alex III, this horrible Tsar who had disastrous and repressive politics? What are you talking about, Vlad? And this is a question about not just moral judgment, but moral judgment of people in the past in different cultural circumstances. So that's a great question. We'll talk about it. Vlad, what about the most hyper-reactionary and conservative voices in Russia? Is Alexander Dugin, this man that some of you have heard of, one of them? And what do these voices sound like? Voices that might be even more conservative and militaristic than the Russian regime. Do they exist, and what are they saying? Can you say something about the links between Lenin, Putin, and Alexander III? Sure. And what were the earlier models, historical models, for Putin's regime? If you're saying it's Alexander III now, what was it 20 years ago? Can you say something about that? So this is what we're talking about. So let's start with why I like Tsar Alex III. I suppose we can ask it like this. Could we like somebody today, personally, who was doing what Vladimir Putin is doing? No, obviously not. Could we like someone today who had Putin's views about the world and Putin's responses to the world, but didn't start any wars? No, not really. And as it happens, I've never met Putin, but as it happens, I don't like him personally. That's to say, in an alternate reality where Putin is not in politics at all, I wouldn't find him terribly likable. That's a very fascinating counterfactual, actually, because that shows how fragile this business is about whether you become evil, you know? What about Karadzic, the war criminal who wreaked so much havoc in the Balkans in the 90s? He was running a psychiatric hospital before. We don't know how he was running it, but if he were running it humanely and competently, then he could have carried on doing that, not got into politics, not become a murderer, an ethnic cleanser, and a war criminal, and would have judged him differently. So then, can we say that his character changed as he went into politics? No. It's the same character, but this is what being in politics did with him ethically. So you've got to be clear that while there are some people who would never do certain things, the number of people who would do really bad things if they were in politics is dizzyingly high. And the number of people who would do bad things if they stayed in power, especially unchecked power, for a very, very, very long time is dizzyingly high. So this is a very fragile relationship between character and morality. Karadzic had the same character, and in an alternate life, he could have just carried on running a psychiatric hospital. So back to Alex III and why I'm drawn to him. I think that there are certain things that, without history being progressive, we still move forward with, for better or worse. One thing is scientific knowledge. Another thing is a kind of historical self-consciousness about where we're at where we've come from, where we're going, you know, you might think that the conversations you and I have on the YouTube channels are weird because they're all about where are we going, where are we, how did we get here, where could we go instead of where we're going. But actually, that's not as weird as it seems. Yes, it's weird. You're talking to a philosopher through some kind of device and screen you're looking at. But it's not that weird. It's not that weird because we are more historically self-conscious than any humans who have ever lived. We constantly ask, where are we and where are we going in history? And we do that in an unprecedented way. No human beings have been more aware than us of their place in history. And then there is something else. There is just sheer reflectiveness. There's just the sheer asking of questions, you know. I've got a video on the channel. I don't think it's that good a video, to be honest, but there I tell a story about an acquaintance of mine who was killed by a tiger shark in Tonga. I think it's a video about moral relativism. It's on the main channel. And I think it's a bit rambly and unprepped, but it shares this story. And the story is basically that an acquaintance of mine was killed by a tiger shark in this very remote island group in Tonga. It didn't have to happen. She didn't have to jump into the water at that time to wave to a friend on a boat, particularly when this was at dusk, this was in a deep channel, this was following a boat, which sharks do. This was close to where fresh water meets seawater, which sharks love. But basically what happened is that the locals thought that something was ethically wrong with her for her to have been killed. And we had a couple of folks staying at the time who had a marine biology background. They were arguing with the locals. This conversation continued, and eventually the locals just changed their mind because enough questions were asked about their narrative about the ethical conduct of sharks. And there were questions like, well, how do you know that sharks are sensitive to moral properties of human beings? Don't you know that marine biologists around the world who study sharks, who swim with sharks, think that sharks have no way of accessing any information about the moral properties of human beings they might attack? And eventually the locals kind of began to think, well, yeah, we had this story, but these guys seem to be studying sharks. I mean, they seem to be from Australia, and Australians are probably professional, competent. They seem to be kind of sincere in saying this. Maybe our belief is BS. Let's question it. And where this landed actually was that this group of locals eventually said, look, yes, if outsiders get attacked by sharks, that's not a moral judgment. But if locals get attacked by sharks, it still is. And a boy from a neighboring village got taken out to sea by a rip and drowned a few weeks later, a local Tongan boy. And the locals said, so when this American Peace Corps volunteer was killed by a shark, it's an accident and a tragedy. But when our local Tongan boy died, yes, he must have been morally compromised. So reflection. When we're talking about Alexander III, this was long, but I was going somewhere with this. We're talking about somebody living 140 years ago when fewer questions would have been asked relative to now about the constructions he had, which were, let's prioritize, the Russian church, the Russian language. This is going to bring us closer to God. This will somehow create the best path for Russia in the world and eventually for everybody who lives in our territory and so on. So because of all of these things, what I'm saying is that Alex III is way less culpable for having a firm attitude of Russification than Putin is, because Putin is having it in 2022. Alex III had it in 1882. And because of that, I genuinely think it's possible to think that Alex is a very likable man. Not just in the sense of some kind of unhealthy division between politics and private life, his professional work and his private work. I'm not making that kind of division. I'm rather saying that as a whole, Alex was more unlucky to be connected with evil policies than Putin is. Putin is much more self-consciously complicit in all of this. He is much more directly culpable. He is bad because he is bad. Alex is more bad because he's unlucky to be bad, you know. Moreover, Alex had a kind of wonderful masculine simplicity to him that made him just not be the kind of person who could, as it was possible at his time, begin to reflect on what it means to have more of a tolerant, more of a pluralistic society, a society where all groups have, rights that are at least moving in the direction of being more equal and so on. So this is a fascinating question because this is basically a conversation about what it means to travel back into the past and exercise ethical judgment over people. And I think that in some ways is impossible. In other ways, it's possible. And how you balance it is a matter of, I think, philosophical awareness, historical sensitivity, and intuition. And so this is a little bit of a sketch of how it's really possible for me to say that Alex III's policies were horrendous, but that I am very personally drawn to this man and I would physically want to give him a hug, whereas I don't want to say on the YouTube what I would want to do with Putin. And then there is, I think, just one final thing to mention that's so interesting that I'm going to do an episode about it, just about it alone. And that's what happens when, no matter how far back we travel into the past, we find that somebody's view is kind of naive, evasive, regressive, even by the standards of their own culture. And an absolutely historically resplendent example of this is the view that one of the greatest geniuses in my profession, in philosophy, and in my profession specifically in moral philosophy, Aristotle, the view that Aristotle took on slavery. So what we've got to understand is that there's a radical difference between modern slavery and ancient slavery. In the modern world, that's to say slavery 200 years ago, it's completely possible to object to that slavery practice by saying, let's imagine a society without this. That's a completely not just raisable question, it's a question that already had been raised. And because that question was available to everyone, it was impossible to justify slavery without a load of bullshit, and more importantly, it wasn't possible to justify the necessity of slavery without a load of bullshit, in 1800, let's say. But for the ancient Greeks over 2,000 years ago, that wasn't the case. They thought slavery was necessary, and I don't think we can criticize them for it. In other words, the cultural resources weren't available to them to entertain the thought that slavery was something you could do without. And that just means that what the ancient Greeks really thought is that slavery wasn't just or unjust, it was just necessary. Just the way you might think, for example, that radical global economic injustice is neither inequality, I beg your pardon, radical global economic inequality is neither just nor unjust because there's nothing we can do about it. And because there's nothing we can do about it, it's sort of just there. And we don't know what to think about it. And it's just sort of a product of how the world runs. And because we don't know what else to do, we can't call it just or unjust. I'm not imposing that view on you, but I'm saying that's a very central feature of the way people in the modern world think. Well, that's how they thought about slavery. They just thought that civilization was inconceivable without it. And eventually questions were asked about that at different points of human history. But back then, these questions weren't sufficiently asked for us to say that it was conceivable for them to really imagine a civilization without this practice. And so the question of its justice, as it were, the justice of slavery, didn't arise properly. So that's where the Greeks were as a matter of historical fact. But what Aristotle did is that he became more conservative and reactionary than the Greeks of his time. And he said, no, slavery is not just necessary, it's just. Because if you practice slavery perfectly, then it's not going to be a violent practice. And there are indeed some human beings who are perfectly suited for that role. And that was, by the standards of Aristotle's time, a very conservative and BS view. Yes, the Greeks thought that from a sort of a vertical bird's eye view, slavery was necessary because surely you need it for a society. But they didn't think that there were particular people who were suited to that task. In other words, they thought that becoming a slave was a disaster and the practice of slavery was cruel. It was just something we didn't know how to be without. It was a social necessity, but it wasn't the case that it was ever possible to justify it to each individual who ended up being a slave. And Aristotle tried to do that, which I think reveals a bit about him being aspirational, conservative, keen to please, a bit of a bullshit. I mean, great genius. But his view was just bullshit by the standards of his own contemporaries. And appropriately, of course, Nietzsche said about this whole thing that the only thing worse than doing slavery is trying to justify it. And in his personal life, Aristotle contradicted his theory and freed his slaves in his will. So that's a little bit about historical judgment. Next, Alexander Dugin and extremely conservative views in Russia. Well, this is going to be interesting if you don't know who Alexander Dugin is, who is a kind of a hyper-reactionary, militaristic, conservative philosopher. Basically, Dugin is two things. He's a pop star, so think Slavoj Žižek, maybe a sort of on-the-cheap version of Slavoj Žižek. He's 50% that, and 50% part, actually, of a very basic tradition in Russia that existed for a long time and was there under Alexander III and is there today under Putin. And that's the tradition of people who come along and say, okay, we've got this ruler who everybody calls, well, not everybody, but who, well, let's separate out different rulers. Let's say today, we've got Putin. Putin is militaristic, conservative, reactionary, imperialistic. But that group of people comes along and says, no. In fact, he is too compliant with the West. He is too much of a wuss. He is too much of a Western liberal apologist. And these are people who really exist, and they really think that these ill-maintained, crappy Russian tanks that are killing civilians in Ukraine are somehow an equivalent of Russia doing what an individual might do if Russia were an individual when they produce a painting or express themselves in some kind of very creative way. These acts of murder and destruction are in fact forms of collective self-realization of the Russian spirit. This nonsense is easy to say in Russia because the government loves people who are way to the, well, I was going to say way to the right. That's not to the right, that's to the crazy of the government. But the Russian government loves people who are way more extreme than it because it normalizes them. So these voices rarely get repressed, even though they are critics of the government. And so Dugin is a critic of the government from the right, or from the crazy position. And he's free to do that, but he's always criticizing Putin for acting too slowly, not being militaristic enough, not taking things far enough. And that group is always there. I mean, unless you have some kind of extreme totalitarianism, there's always going to be a demographic that's more extreme than the regime, no matter how evil the regime is, really. And these people were always there. And when Alex III, who we talked about, in our recent short video on the main channel, was a baby Tsar, before he was a Tsar, it was clear that he was much more conservative than his father, the progressive Tsar Alex II. And so all of these Dugin-like people began to gather around Alex III in anticipation of him becoming a Tsar. He drew them before he came to power. So that demographic is always there, and it seems kind of shocking to us in the West, because we think, well, Putin must be the extremist. No. There are people who are saying he's not going far enough. So I think 50% of Dugin is a pop star, and 50% of Dugin is just a member of this kind of tradition that's existed in Russia for decades and centuries. Next, Lenin, Putin, and Alex III. Well, this is brief. The connection basically is that Lenin's brother was one of the terrorists in the Tsarist period who planned an assassination attempt against Alexander III. Alex III. It didn't go through. He was arrested and executed. Not everyone was executed who was involved with the plot. Some were, some weren't. He was. And this impacted Lenin. I don't know how much it impacted Lenin, because I do think Lenin was already a bit of an unhealthy one. I think that Lenin was a bit of an unhealthy one even from early childhood. This was a kid you'd worry about a bit. And but nevertheless, this event did contribute to Lenin becoming more compelled to go into politics, and becoming perhaps more compelled to go into politics in the only way he could have done, which is a very ugly way. Lenin was a murderous gangster, very talented political theorist, I have to say. And he would have been remembered as that if he didn't go into politics. Very gifted, very good. But, sorry, this is not an endorsement of Marxism. This is an endorsement of how Lenin deals with concepts like power and so on. And Lenin went into politics in the only way he could, very, very ugly, murderous, gangster, wrote edicts like gather up 100 kulaks, rich peasants, and kill them so that the people will see, so that the people will tremble. He died in 1924. If he'd gone on longer, he would have been more murderous than he could be. Don't think he would have been quite as bad as Stalin, but he would have been bad. Putin hates him because Lenin stands for everything Putin is terrified of, revolution. Lenin is the incarnation of Putin's worst nightmare. That's a point, by the way, for people who think Putin wants to rejuvenate the Soviet Union. Well, not in that sense. So Lenin is Putin's nightmare, and Alex III is Putin's dream politician, even though he misunderstands Alex III. Earlier models for Putin. I remember having a conversation about this, which I want to share briefly. So earlier models for Putin would have been other more progressive Tsars, and I think the clearest early model for Putin, it didn't prove to be the case, it didn't follow in his footsteps, would have been Tsar Alexander II, who was progressive, who had a constitution on his table when he was killed, who, even though it's a very troubling story, but at least formally liberated the serfs in the early 1860s. And historians who are favorable to Alex II talk about him doing a kind of revolution from above, which was to be seen, as a series of steps forward before Russia developed more aspects of an institutional democracy, as it did a little bit, particularly under Nicholas II. And at first, to some people, it felt like Putin could follow in the footsteps of Alexander II, that Putin could do a kind of revolution from above. And the thought was that Putin was centralizing power, yes, taking power from the regions, bringing control back into the center, so as to engage in the kind of reform that would make Russia a properly functional state. And once it sort of kind of worked, we could then take it from there. I didn't like Putin from the very beginning, didn't like him from the 90s. He was obviously not interested in freedom of speech, for example. But I thought that there was a chance with the right people around him that could be one of the possible destinations. And that might be the way to talk about him in the early noughties. And yes, I remember having a conversation with a guy called Adam Roberts, Sir Adam Roberts, who is a famous international relations expert, who, by the way, recently responded to John Mearsheimer in The Economist. And you can trust, in my opinion, Adam way more than Mearsheimer. I'll link that up below. Unfortunately, I think that The Economist is paywalled. But I remember doing the dishes with Adam Roberts in the Oxford Politics School about 20 years ago and saying, well, I think we don't understand what's going on with Putin. I don't think it's going in some kind of liberal democratic direction, no chance of that. But we could be looking, if things go well, at a period of reforms that, if they work, could be modeled on what the kind of revolution from above that happened under Alex II in Russia. And of course, that didn't materialize. That's not what happened. But sure, there were other models for Putin. Putin had other heroes. Alex III is only his hero from, as I say, about seven years ago. And I would argue now, Alex III can't really be his hero because he's way worse than Alex III. Way, way worse. He starts wars. And Alex III didn't do that. Progress and history. I should say something about this quickly. Look, I think that what I'm trying to do on the main YouTube channel is package things in a way that brings the points across subtly. And the point of that last Alex III video was really that Russian history is repeating itself, by which I don't mean that there is some kind of preset cycle. All I mean is that this is stuff we've seen before. Russia has invaded neighboring countries or ethnically cleansed populations, or smashed the rights of minorities on the periphery of the Russian state or the Russian Empire, the Soviet state, dozens of times in the last couple of centuries. Dozens of times. So that's why this expression of a Tsar with nuclear weapons makes sense. I think with this war, the model is probably Alex III's grandfather, Nicholas I, who is even worse than Alex III for Putin. That's the model for Putin now. So we're not seeing anything new. We're seeing old patterns, perhaps with new risks. We're not seeing anything new. And what is fundamentally important about this, that was really the point of the video, as subtle as it was left, is that these sorts of people like Putin are not the past. They are not necessarily the future either, but they're at least as much the future as they are the past. Putin is not some kind of, outbreak of regressive historical forces that influences. He's not. He is a very modern politician, of which we will have more. So wars being started for mystical reasons, as is the case with Putin to some extent, and wars being started for resource and territorial reasons, as is not the case with this war in the Ukraine, is going to be a part of our life. And there isn't a way of growing past that. So what I want to say is, don't think of Putin as an outbreak of his, primitive irrationality that's not part of your modern world. It's natural to feel like that because, my word, this is Europe and what is happening in Europe in the 21st century, blah, 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 blah. But no, I mean, there's really no reason why major European states can't be, why Germany and France can't be at war with each other 150 years from now. There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be the case. None at all. So that's where we are, Putin is life. Putin is history. It's just the history we desperately don't want to see. And we want to see as little of it as possible. But there isn't a place on which, there isn't some kind of magical platform on which we can stand and proclaim without bullshitting ourselves that Putin is more part of the past and something else is, that the Prime Minister of New Zealand is part of the future. No. They're both part of the future, and we just need to do our best to walk this future in the most truthful and hopeful way possible. And I think talking about all of this is one way to help us do it better. Thank you so much for this conversation under the London sky, which doesn't feel too polluted. It feels quite pristine, and it's just rained. This rooftop terrace is at the moment a construction site, so I apologize for the mess you're seeing. Thank you, and talk very, very soon. Lots of love.